Good morning. It's good to see you all. Pleased with the presence of each and every one of you. If you're visiting with us, we're so happy you're with us. If you haven't got a welcome packet yet, we encourage you to pick one up on your way out this morning and fill out that visitor's card so we can thank you for being here. It's our first Sunday, which means we're going to be in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 5 this morning. We are continuing our preaching theme for the year, looking at another section of the Sermon on the Mount and what it has to teach about what it means to be a disciple and what God expects from us. This morning, we're going to be dealing with a section in the Sermon on the Mount that probably contains some of the most radical teachings of Jesus, which means we as believers and citizens of the kingdom must struggle not to resist the clear teachings of this section. We must struggle not to weasel out of them, to redefine words, but to simply let the words of Christ speak for themselves. And what section is this? We are in Matthew 5, starting in verse 27. Should be through 38, apologize. And this whole section in the sermon, and for the bulk of chapter 5, as we noted last time, the key to understand this section is found in Matthew 5 and verse 20. When Jesus is done teaching about his relationship to the Word of God, he says, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." And so in each of these pericopes, these little sections in the sermon, Jesus will quote either the received tradition or the misapplication of what the law said. And then he will take that lowered standard and give us the standard that God gave originally. And in doing so, he's not simply just giving correct exposition of the old law. He's going back to the universal moral principles that God gave in the beginning. And so to read this section simply as Jesus teaching on the law is too superficial and too weak of a reading. Yes, he is doing that, but he is giving us the central morals and ethics of the church and for our lives. And so in these three units this morning, 27 through 38, dealing with lust, adultery, and our words, they're really all dealing with the same thing, and that's integrity. How are we to have integrity when we relate to those of the opposite sex, in our marriages, and in our speech? And so with that, we're going to be starting in verse 27, and let's just read the whole section and we'll start breaking it down. "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it far from you. For it would be better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. It was said, 'Whoever sends away his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce.' But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that the ancients were told, 'You shall not make false vows, but you shall fulfill your vows to the Lord.' But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you make any oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these is of evil." So we begin with the first pericope, where Jesus deals with lust in the heart. He said, "You have heard it said, 'You shall not commit adultery.'" And again, the key to remembering how the Pharisees viewed their righteousness was as long as we didn't break the letter of the law, we were good. And here's a section of immense application for our current moral and cultural climate. When we read through these three sections, we tend to think perhaps these were just first century issues. But let's consider. In the first century, you had rampant divorce. The Roman lawyer Cicero wrote that the only reason a Roman woman got married was so that she could divorce in order that she could marry again. That was the approach. Greeks were just as bad. Well, it seems like every preacher at least 5 times a year, I'm making that up, has to quote that the divorce rate in this country is 50%. And that's probably out of date now. Okay? It's rampant. But really, that's not what this text is dealing with at all. It's the run-amok objectification of the opposite sex. A sex culture. We think that we've moved beyond the fertility idols of the first century, haven't we? But I tell you that we have not. I'm always amazed that whenever I'm flying, going to meetings, you always go into mini-marts and airports, and they have tons of magazines. I'm always looking for the really boring ones like Popular Mechanics and everything. I'm trying to find the new tool reviews or something. But the sad thing is, what used to never be in public spaces is there is a row on the top where they have to put black pieces of plastic to cover the covers. I'll let you make the application from that inference there, what they're covering. Or certain industries, or any of our sports, really. Well, likewise, we have rampant sexual immorality. We have rampant, widespread divorce. And thanks to the lawsuit generation of the 80s, I'll lay the blame there. And not only that, but words mean nothing anymore. No one can be taken at their word at face value. One thing my dad always taught me was no matter what you're dealing with, get it in writing. Any sort of deal, everything, make sure you get ink on paper and you get it in writing so you have proof of it, especially with family, which is the inverse of how it should be, right? So this section is immensely applicable to our current day. So Jesus said, again, verse 27, you have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. The Pharisees were their whole concern was, as long as you didn't commit the act, ignoring completely everything that leads up to that act. No one trips and falls into adultery. There is a path. There is a path with several, we might say smaller, but they're not small in the eyes of God, violation of the divine law. And so when Jesus says, but I say to you that everyone looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. That, as a new Christian, hit me like a gut punch. And I think it hit everyone who originally heard the sermon, everyone who ever hears the sermon, as a gut check. And let's not read into it as only lusting after women. It cuts both ways. He's talking about your relationship with the opposite sex. Absolutely. And the Pharisees should have known better, because actually the law did condemn lusting after that which was not your own, a spouse who was not your own. For example, in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 17, in the 10th commandment about coveting, we always remember thou shalt not covet, right? Well, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. And the law was not saying about the person who is geographically approximate to your living space. The whole world is your neighbor. And it's interesting there, if you look at that word covet, Mons defines it as to desire earnestly, long for something, lust. carries that same idea. Brother Earnhardt, in his book, Invitation to a Spiritual Revolution, said that lust is not a fleeting thought, but a gathering up of one's minds for the purpose of lusting. The Greek text describes a person who directs his thoughts or turns his mind to a thing, in this case, lusting after a woman or a man. It's not simply you accidentally saw somebody running in what we would consider inappropriate clothing by Reed Park. The momentary glimpse is not what Jesus is condemning here. Now, if we decide that I'm going to keep staring and keep taking the mental picture so I can save that for later, that's a problem. That's a problem. But think about it. It's not enough simply not to commit the act. You have to guard yourself against what comes from the heart, the thoughts. Because thoughts become actions, actions become habits, and habits become character of who you are. Reminds me of what Jesus said later on in the Gospel of Matthew. Actually, later on in the Sermon on the Mount. He said, if your eye is, the eye is the lamp of the body. And if you're receiving light, the inside will be lightness. But if you're receiving darkness, how great is that darkness? He's not teaching about glasses and cataracts. He's teaching about what we watch, what we consume, what we preoccupy ourselves with. And the big irony thing is about the current cultural issues. There's been justified reckonings of awful, awful abuses in the last couple years. But the thing is, the culture's kind of left scratching their head like, how do we get here? Well, you're reaping what you're sowing. When sex becomes simply a thing, when marriage is simply reduced to a contract, when fidelity in marriage, which we'll deal in just a moment, is optional, we should not be surprised if we have a society that is abusive and objectifying the sexes and treats marriage as simply an optional thing. You can't have it both ways. You can't. We would do well to remember the words of Solomon in Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 23. And we need to watch our heart with all diligence, from it flows a spring of life. What we occupy ourselves, what we think about, as we already said, we become. So if we have a habit of objectifying the other sex through lusting and viewing them as simply as an object for our sexual gratification, don't be surprised if we start treating the opposite sex as mere objects to be used and discarded. And so Jesus calling this attention, like, it's not simply enough to not do the thing. You have to have integrity with how you view other people, for they are precious souls created in the image of God. And so the application is quite clear what Jesus makes here, falling in Matthew 5, 29 through 30. He uses very shocking language, and I have to give the normal caveat. Jesus is not teaching here self-mutilation. But he says, if the right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for the whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand is what makes you stumble, amputate it immediately and throw it as far as it can from you. For it would be better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for the whole to enter hell. His application is clear. Whatever is hindering you from God, what is causing you to sin, why are you keeping it around? Remove it far away from you. I have known brethren who have struggled with lust. And so they finally got to a point where they said, why am I keeping this dumb computer in my house? Now they took it out back because they lived in the country and shot it with a shotgun. That's the fun way of killing sin. Hot take from Brenden, the fun way of killing sin. That's probably not the best way of wording it, but then there's others who took it out to the dumpster and said, I'm done with this. It's better to go without television or a computer than to have those temporary luxuries, if we want to call them that, and enter into eternal hell. It is better to go without keeping up with the Kardashians than to do so and lose your salvation. If it sounds shocking and drastic what Jesus is teaching here, it's because it is. You don't need any earthly pleasure to get to heaven. You do need Christ and a right relationship with Him. And so Jesus said very simply, you think as long as you don't commit the act, you're righteous. That's not. There's millions of people every day that don't commit adultery and yet still have lustful hearts. Citizens of the kingdom need to view the opposite gender with integrity as persons, created in the divine image of God and precious in His sight. Now, related to that, he goes into then divorce. Kingdom citizens, God expects fidelity in marriage, which you can see how the lust thing goes into this. And so what was the tradition? In verse 31, he said, it was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorcement. Now, what the Pharisees had done, and without going into the whole debate, but in the first century, the Pharisees were so obsessed with the grounds and justification and the defense of divorce, they completely missed what the law taught. In fact, what they're quoting here, or what my Bible says they're quoting here, is from Deuteronomy, and they ripped the very tail end of a long sentence of conditional clauses, where the law basically went, if this happens, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens, then give her a certificate of divorcement. There was a long conditional sets that had to be met for the law. And in the law, that was a protection for her so that she had the right to remarry and be protected in that ancient Bronze Age world. But the Pharisees had simply turned it into, as long as your paperwork is in order, you're good. Doesn't matter the reason, doesn't matter the cause. As long as she has gotten that piece of paper, you're righteous. And the sad thing is, this is not a first century debate. Judaism that exists today all is from the school of the Pharisees. That's the only thing that survived after the destruction of Jerusalem. And today in New York, actually in some of those Orthodox cities, there's a real problem where the husbands will divorce their wives and they will never give her the piece of paper. And in current Jewish understanding, that means she's not free to do anything. Just kind of waving it over her. That's how ludicrous that they've gotten on this misapplication. So again, Jesus' words here was just as shocking as what we just read before. He said, you may think that as long as your paperwork's in order, you're fine, but I'm here to tell you that everyone who divorces his wife, save for the cause of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. New American Standard uses the word unchastity, and it does mean the same thing, but the NIV and New King James has sexual immorality. Young's Literal Translation, which goes painfully to the original, says, whoever divorces a wife except for the reason of whoredom. And the idea here in the verse is that there has been marital infidelity. Somebody has committed adultery and the marriage covenant has been defiled, which is consistent with what Jesus taught in Matthew 19. that the only biblical justifiable grounds for divorce, where the innocent party may remarry, is if there was adultery. Anything beyond that, there is no right for either party. And notice the language here. Again, Jesus is speaking to his day and age, but it's a universal principle. But the day he is teaching in, it was the men who filed for divorce, and it was the men who put these women in this situation. New American Standard hits around the head, makes her commit adultery. That is the inference there is that she will have to remarry because women did not work jobs in the first century to support themselves. It was just the reality of the ancient world. And so in another way, he's also saying, you may think that if you give her the piece of paper, you're good, but I'm here to tell you that if you do so, except for the reason of adultery, you have put her in a position where more sin is going to come about. And you are culpable. Again, there were probably some in that original audience who were sitting there and thinking, man, I'm in trouble. And it's interesting that Jesus makes no explicit application here. Because the teaching should be clear enough that those and us should get it. That marriage requires the utmost loyalty and commitment to the spouse and to God. Which is why that first pericope comes into play here. A spouse that fills their heart with lust, who does not guard the heart above all others, is contributing and putting themselves in a situation where Jesus had to teach on this second pericope about marriage and divorce. And I'm reminded of the words of the Hebrew writer in Hebrews 13 and verse 4. That marriage is to be held in honor among all, and the marriage bed is to be undefiled. For fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. And this is perhaps an application related to sharing the gospel with people. When I was in high school, I was in the minority in the sense that I had both parents at home still. And they would be the first to tell you that their marriage wasn't perfect. And I know some of you older Christians would tell me none is, but I digress. It was so common that all my friends had to alternate Christmases and Thanksgivings and go from, I'm at dad's this weekend, mom's this weekend. Even the sadder cases where the mother or the father just completely abandoned the family and they have no relationship with them. And how rare it was to actually have a whole household. Even rarer in our current climate to have a whole household in which both are Christians, seeking to live by the teachings of Galatians, where love and respect is in the home, where the wife is cherished and the husband is honored, where the Lord is put first and the children are raised up in the fear and admonition of Him, to where the broken world will see that and go, what makes you different? Why are you having a 50-year marriage? When some of my friends, their parents were only married 4 or 5. And that becomes an avenue to show people the better way of Christ. It really does. We don't think of that as being anything special when we're Christians for any length of time. Yeah, people get married and they stay married till they'll die. Yeah, what's so amazing about that? It's mind-blowing amazing in the world. We should give motivation to the married here to invest and build and nurture and protect the marriage, because you get to shine Christ out to the world. Now, not to ignore the single persons, but to find single persons who are not given completely over to lust, That's also a rarity. There's any number of dating apps out there that the sole purpose of those apps is simply to find a one-night stand. And that's the whole purpose. In fact, it's gotten so bad that one of the most popular classes at Harvard is Dating 101. And we laugh at that, but it's full and there's a wait list every quarter. Because young people are like, we don't know how to date where we're just having a conversation. So finding a young person who's not given over to that, who is actually seeking to know another person, to see if there's compatibility there, to see if that's maybe a match for marriage, that is powerful witnessing as well. So don't think that the sexual ethics of the kingdom is humdrum. They're powerful because they shine Christ to the world. And it's interesting, Jesus is dealing with a separate question in Matthew 19, but when he answers there, he doesn't go back to what the law says. He goes back to the beginning. In creation, that God made them male and female. Marriage is for life, except for the cause of adultery. And that even then, the Bible, I believe, would teach to seek reconciliation first before the discussion of divorce comes up. In fact, one minister reading in his commentary, he made the point that when a couple comes to him, he doesn't talk about divorce at all. There's two other conversations he has before they ever get to that one. One is making sure that we have a healthy appreciation for what the Bible teaches about marriage. And then and then he goes on to reconciliation if there's problems. And he said in all his years of experience, he said, normally by the time we're done with the second conversation, the third one never comes up. But God knows that there comes a time where there has to be a severance, and that is the cause, and that is really the one that God has seen and knows that's the deal breaker for many people. So what do we then do with Jesus' teaching here about words? We've been talking about lusting and adultery this morning, about how they're wrong and what we need to do and how we need to be proper and right and righteous. So what do we do with these words here? Well, they still tie in, again, dealing with the idea of integrity. So in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 33, Jesus said, again you have heard it said, or again you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but you should fulfill your vows. Now, that's the key there with how the Pharisees understood it. That vows that were unto the Lord, those were the binding ones. But vows to anything else, take it or leave it. We see some of this in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 16, where Jesus, in the woes to the Pharisees, he says, woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. That's just one example, but they had a whole hierarchy of binding vows and unbinding vows, or non-binding vows. So what's the end result of their practice of this? You can't trust the word they said. That they would vow things to conceal that they had no interest whatsoever in actually carrying out the vow. Because they could say, well, I didn't vow unto the Lord. It was simply by the temple. And that gives us some light of why Jesus says the things that he says. Again, he says in verses 34 and 35 in Matthew 5, but I say unto you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it's the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. What Jesus is attacking here is not the swearing of oaths, but deceit in the words of the Pharisees. Paul the Apostle himself, we dealt with this several weeks ago Sunday morning, they had some Christians in Jerusalem who were under an oath. God makes oaths to us, so it's not oath swearing he is condemning. It is oath swearing to conceal deceit or no intent to carry it out. And really what Jesus is pointing out, that all the Pharisees' distinctions were distinctions without a difference. Because none of our words are ever uttered outside the presence of God. We are always in the presence of God. And all of our words are binding. Or they should be. And I, of course, have to bring up the verse that terrifies me the most in all of Scripture. It's terrified me before I was a preacher, before I even did teaching. In Matthew 12, 36 and 37, he says, "But I tell you that every careless word that people speak, they shall give an accounting for it in the day of judgment. For by your words you'll be justified, and by your words you'll be condemned." My old Bible, this was highlighted, underlined in red pen, starred in black pen. It was marked 5 or 6 different ways. Because I say a lot of words. And I don't always say the best ones. And sometimes I feel like I have chronic foot and mouth disease. But I thank God that perhaps the only words that he will need to call into account on the day of judgment, for me at least, is when I confess that I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and I was baptized for remission of my sins. But it still adds weight to every single word we say. And so Jesus is saying here, all oaths, but simply is saying, you should have no need of them. Your yeses should simply be yes. I mean, that's the application point. When you say yes, people should be yes. And when you say no, they understand it should be no. That if you've made a commitment or you said something, you should be able to trust them. You know, when I bought my house, for example, I'm just going to speak in generalities, there was no contracts. It was simply done with a handshake and our word. Now, it was with another Christian, and so that changes a few things. And when it came time to actually make the sale, there was a contract, but everything else leading up to that, the remodel, everything, that should be how dealing with the Christian is. That even if a person does not believe the faith, they should understand that I'm dealing with somebody who has a reputation for having integrity, and I can trust what they say. Make no mistake, we're far from being over with the Sermon on the Mount. At the end of the month, Lord willing, we'll be looking at the final set of pericopes in which Jesus gives us our teaching on how we should treat and view enemies. And it's not with hatred. In fact, it's with a greater love than perhaps we would have for our brethren. But this morning, I hope we have seen that the kingdom of God demands people of integrity. People who treat the opposite sex not as objects to be lusted after, but as people to be respected. That marriage should be held in honor by all, and we should have a fidelity in our marriages. Not simply seeking to get out of them, but seeking to strengthen them. Guarding our hearts against everything that would tear down or invade that covenant. And we as people of the kingdom should be people can take us at our word. But perhaps you're here this morning and you've never considered this. You don't know, it sounds all good, but you have no idea how to get into the kingdom. You know, Jesus, at the beginning of the sermon, the very first beatitude, he said, "Blessed are those who are poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God." I liked how one translation worded this. Blessed are the people who understand their deep spiritual needs without God. If you recognize that you have a gaping hole, that you have sin in your life, and that God is the only answer, you have that first beatitude. The kingdom is yours if you will confess Christ and put him on in the waters of baptism. For Jesus himself said that he that believeth in me and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be condemned. If you have needed that this morning, you have sin that needs confessing, you need to return to the Lord. If we can pray with you, pray for you, won't you come as you ever stand and sing the song that's been selected?